Hello everyone, welcome to the demonstration of En-ROAD's climate simulation tool. This tool is available freely and is accessible publicly on their website. In today's session, Ed4S Academy will unpack different levers that could be used to simulate future scenarios at which the world warms at 1.5, at 2 degrees, 3 degrees, etc. So we're very excited to have you here today. Our Chief Content Officer, Matt Orsagh, will walk you through the process. But before I pass the mic to Matt, let me just quickly explain what we do at Ed4S. We generally work with large companies that wish to train their employees by developing e-learning solutions that they roll out internally, customized based on their sector and the role, and are able to onboard systematically people across different departments, train them around topics of sustainability, ESG, and empower them to act and create initiatives around these topics. Without any further ado, let me introduce Matt.
Thanks you guys for coming. And I want to thank first En-ROADS, or the folks at MIT, Climate Interactive, and Ventana Systems who built En-ROADS. It's this great simulation on climate change. It came out a couple years ago, and I want to help people walk through it. I encourage you all to kind of play with it on your own. It's free. Just En-ROADS.org, or just in your search engines, just look for En-ROADS EN-ROADS. And this is what you get. It's a simulator looking at if we do all of these different things, different policies, different ways of doing transportation and land use, carbon removal and growth, buildings and industry. If we address all these things, what do we get? Before we start, Maria and I were talking about and kind of walking through the simulation ourselves, and we noticed that certain things had a bigger impact on the temperature going down. You'll see on the top right corner, that's that 3.4 degrees Celsius. That's where we are now, or 6.1 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the world we're in now, about what we expect things to be by the end of the century on the current path we're on. Now, of course, efforts are trying to change that path, bend that curve down. But before we start, I know the answer to this question, so I'm not gonna put my thoughts in. But we wanted to see people in the chats, what you can guess is going to have the biggest impact, or what things are going to have the biggest impact on pulling that curve down, getting rid of emissions. I'll just walk through them. Coal, oil, natural gas, bioenergy, and of course that's pulling those down. Renewables, nuclear, net zero, carbon price. Those would be an investment in those things. Transport, energy efficiency, electrification. Energy efficiency of buildings, electrification of buildings, an industry, growth, population growth, or slowing down in population growth, population shrinking, economic growth or degrowth on the other side, or post-growth on the other side, and then land use, deforestation, stopping deforestation, methane and gas and other gases, handling those, afforestation, that's planting trees, or technological breakthroughs. Those are your choices. So take a couple seconds, we figure we'll give you 10, 20 seconds, and put in your votes, or what do you think are going to be the biggest impacts before we get started? After we go through all of those things, we'll go through a little bit of the graphs and the impacts these things have. Impacts on temperature change, sea level rise, pollution, crop yields, all those kind of things. And you can go down a lot of different things. You can look at emissions, population, GDP, financials, land, forestry use, impacts on food systems, those kind of things. There's a lot of stuff to play with here, and we're not going to get to it all. I really encourage people to use this tool, and to talk about it and share it with other people, because it really shows you that the solutions to climate change are exactly that. It's plural. It's not one thing. It's all of the above. But if we've got a couple answers in, Maria, share those with what people are telling us they think are the biggest impacts, and we'll go from there. And before we get started, I'll talk a little bit about the graphs. You can put a bunch of different graphs on the front page. For example, I have, global sources of energy and temperature change here, but you can change these You can do a number of different graphs to start with and see how those change, or even smaller graphs so you get more things on the page to look at all at once. So it really depends on how you want to do things, but I'll just go back to the main graphs before we get started. And it's interesting, you'll see this little dip here around 2020. That's of course 2019 to 2021, and that's of course COVID. And you can see how energy use dipped. We had a little experiment on climate mitigation, and the curve that, those curves, if we stay on that path and use less energy and on all those things, that's supposed to bend this curve down. All right, what kind of answers are we getting, Maria?
So we have a couple of answers. One of them from Julio: all can have impacts, but I'm inclined to bet on food, land, and industry. That could make a difference. We have another one from Marshall: reduction in oil dependency and increasing exposure to alternative energy options, and the carbon price. So otherwise, it's pretty quiet in chat. Hopefully we'll warm up towards the end of the session.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll get started. So you start to see this curve bend. I'll start with the biggest impact that we've seen, and do a drum roll at your desk, but that's going to be carbon price. So see what happens when we move carbon price at status quo to a low carbon price. It already moves it from 3.4 to 3.2. And now if you get to a medium carbon price, and you can see the energy mix on the left side of the screen going down. A high carbon price is 2.8 Celsius, very high 2.5, all the way down to 2.3. So that moved us more than a whole degree centigrade, or Celsius, excuse me. That's the biggest impact we see. And you'll see as that carbon price goes up, look at that fuel mix. That fuel mix is coal, the oil is orange, then gas, then renewables, bioenergy, nuclear, new zero, new technologies. That's what that is. And then, oops, sorry.
Quick question, Matt.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do we know what is their definition of the high price? Have they do they give information about the metrics?
Yeah, I was going to jump into that. Thanks.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. That's a great question. That's the natural question. So I'll move this dial all the way back, right? And see, look at that the green energy go up, because of course, as the price of fossil fuels goes up because of a high carbon price, the green and bio and nuclear and new zero are going to take that place. You'll see these 3 dots above everything. That tells you kind of the assumptions they make. So a carbon price that's very high is $250 per ton of CO2. Right now in the European Union, that has the highest price on carbon, it's around, the last time I checked a couple months ago, it was around $100 per ton. So let's say we go back to $100 per ton, somewhere around there, and you're at 2.6. So still a big impact, but not as big. Your carbon price starts to phase in is now, but of course, if it doesn't start to phase in until the second half of the century, that's not going to make much of a difference. So you can play with these dials, and there's what I'm going to show you here is just kind of the tip of the iceberg for En-ROADS. You can go down and look at these assumptions and change some of them. Years to achieve initial carbon price, final price, all these kind of things. So I'm just going to kind of play with the dials just at the high level, but you can go in and see how will different things impact climate change. Another one I thought was interesting to look at is, and I'm going to do all of these, but you'll hear politicians say, or companies say, we're going to plant trees to solve climate change. And the one I've heard the most in the past couple of years is we're going to plant 1 trillion trees to stop climate change. Well, let's go to that. Let's go to afforestation over here. That's planting trees. It's at 2.3 now after we've got a very high carbon price. And we'll see what that does. Not a lot. It does something, but not a lot. And we'll see the assumptions behind that. And it's, they use all land for afforestation that's available. It starts now. And so you see this graph, because trees take a little bit of time to grow, the impact really doesn't start till about 2040. And then you'll see it's bigger as things go along. Because if you're planting those trees, start planting those trees now, it's really going to take a while for that to have a big impact. The saying goes, the time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. And that really is the case for afforestation, because to have an impact, you have to do that with afforestation 20 years ago. Not that it doesn't make an impact, but you'll see if someone says, well, we just need to plant a lot of trees, we do, but there's more to it than that. Another impact that was pretty big is technological. So look where we are, 2.2 Celsius, and technological advances has moved at 0.3 degrees Celsius. And this is things like carbon capture and storage. What does that mean? Afforestation, BECCS, DECCS, mineralization, agriculture, soil erosion, biochar. BECCS is what is it? It's BECCS. I forget the B, but carbon capture and storage. And then DAX is similar. Mineralization is it's interesting, like weathering of rocks. Rocks actually absorb carbon dioxide, but very slowly. So increased mineralization, agricultural soil carbon, soils taking up more carbon. Biochar is a form of coal, or a form of charred carbon. You put it in the ground after it's been charred, and it helps the ground absorb more carbon. So that's what that is. But technological advances in carbon capture and storage has a big impact, but they're not quite proven yet. So you'll see we've done those three things, and by the end of the century, we're right at 2.0, right? If you remember the Paris Agreement, that's where the Paris Agreement said they wanted to be by 2050. Now, that's assuming a very high carbon price, afforestation, doing the best we can do on afforestation, and technological advances doing the best we can do. Now, I'm going to go back to the other side and start looking at energy resources. So we already have a huge carbon price, so coal is probably pretty low. But let's move coal all the way to the other side, very highly taxed. Doesn't really move things a lot because carbon price has already done a lot of the work there. Oil, very highly taxed, moves things a little. Natural gas, very highly taxed, not much. Bioenergy, same thing. So moving all those things, higher taxes on fossil fuels and a high carbon price has moved things a lot. Now we'll get into renewables, highly subsidized, nuclear, highly subsidized, and new zero carbon. You'll see the new zero carbon is, huge breakthroughs is that orange. And this is things like, I saw an article last week on white hydrogen. If you're interested in hydrogen and hydrogen power, there's green hydrogen, which is produced with no hydrogen in nature, always binds to things. You're not going to find hydrogen by itself. It's a great fuel because all it produces is water in the end, but it's not found by itself usually. And so you have green hydrogen, which is made, hydrogen is separated from water usually through electricity that is green, or blue hydrogen, or brown hydrogen is the worst, where it's produced but through dirty energy. And white hydrogen is deposits of hydrogen that's pure hydrogen that people have begun to find in the natural world. There was just an article last week I saw in this big white hydrogen find in France, and they're looking for more. And that's great. And if we have more things like that, that's what huge breakthroughs are, or nuclear fission that we heard about, last year, that finally became a reality. Now, bringing that online as a power source is a huge engineering problem that could take decades, if not more. So that's what we're talking about with huge breakthroughs. So we've taken care of all the energy supply, done a little bit of carbon removal through afforestation and technological advances. Now we'll look at kind of the transport sector, buildings, and growth. Energy efficiency and transport. You can see if things move a little bit more to the energy efficiency side. It doesn't move that number, but you can see the graph of the energy use impact there. Electrification. Oh, I'm sorry, I moved the wrong way. Energy efficiency is highly increased. Electrification is highly subsidized in the transport sector. Energy efficiency, buildings and industry, it highly increases. Electrification, buildings and industry, highly increases. And you'll see one of the interesting things to see is energy efficiency. This is where we were. And look at all that energy we needed, exajoules per year. We needed, what, about a little under 800. But if efficiencies go up a lot, we need only about half of that, which is amazing. So that's the huge impact energy efficiency can have. You need half of the energy by the end of the century. And of course, it gets worse if we don't have energy efficiency improvements. You can see how much worse, how much you need double the, all right, let's go back. You need about 800 exajoules per year of energy as things stand now on the status quo, or by the end of the century, excuse me, that's what you'll need. If it's discouraged, you'll need twice that much. If it's encouraged, you'll need half that much. So you can see a huge impact energy efficiency has. Now let's go on to growth. We'll look at population. And here's an interesting one, looking at kind of the assumptions they make. I keep hitting the wrong side of my mouse, I apologize. Population, they're assuming 10.4 billion people in 2100. If you remember earlier this year, we just passed 8 billion people on the planet. So 10.4, keep that in mind. Say population is high growth, that will assume 12.4 billion people. And it's up to 1.6, it stays at 1.6. If we have low growth population, we get to 1.5, and they're assuming about 8.8 billion people on the planet by the end of the century. Now, I've seen a lot of different estimates on this number, and I've seen it much lower than 8.8, like somewhere in the 7.5-ish, somewhere in there. If population really, it's supposed to start declining in the second half of the century, but through events we can't foresee or problems, we already are seeing problems with fertility dropping over the past half a century. If that trend continues, due to they're not sure what it is, but it's probably environment is what they think. If those things keep degrading, if people, because of the challenges of climate change or economic challenges, decide to have smaller families, or if God forbid, there's more events because of climate change that cause mass starvations, mass migrations, those kind of things, you could have a population that's much lower than 8.8. But this is the lower bound that En-ROADS lets us go. So that gets us to about 1.5. Economic growth, if economic growth is high, we go back to 1.6. If it's low, it goes down to 1.4. And let's look at the assumptions they make. Long-term economic growth, GDP per person, is 0.5 a year. What if we wanted to do kind of a degrowth world or a post-growth world where that was zero? Well, it doesn't let you do that. So they're assuming the least you can have is 0.5. Near-term economic growth, we can put that down to 1.7, and that moves things down a little bit. But again, if that were to be less, then this curve would go even lower. So look where we are. We still have a couple of things to do, but this temperature change you see here, degrees Celsius and Fahrenheit, or degrees Celsius, excuse me, we're already below 1.5 by the end of the century. And we still have a couple more levers to use. Deforestation, of course, deforestation now, one of the biggest drivers of deforestation is agriculture. And most of that is beef production. So I'm not saying the world can go vegan tomorrow, but imagine if a lot of the deforestation due to beef production went down because there was a overtime 10%, 20% reduction in the demand for beef, whether it's priced higher or things or people's taste changed. What would that mean? So deforestation, not only beef production, but just that's the biggest driver of deforestation. If we took care of deforestation and it was highly reduced, that wouldn't change things a lot, but it would be in the right direction. And finally, methane and other gases are brought under control. We get down to 1.0 Celsius by the end of the century. And you can see that curve, that black curve is the baseline, the business as usual curve on temperature, under temperature change. And the blue curve is what we've done with these assumptions. We peaked at about 1.5, probably a little bit over 1.5 just before 2040, and then steadily went down. But the caveat we have to realize is we've done everything right. We've done everything right from a climate perspective. We've highly taxed energy supplies and moved to clean energy. We're more efficient in transport and buildings and industry, and electrification has taken over there. Population is as low as it's going to be. Economic growth is very tepid, very contained. Deforestation is taken care of, and afforestation is we're planting trees as much as we can, or have planted trees as much as we can. Methane and other gases are taken control of, and technologically we have new advances in carbon capture and storage. If all those things go the right way, we have about a 1.0 world by the end of the century. And again, you look at some of the assumptions there. Afforestation assumes we can plant so many trees. What if that number is so many hectares higher? That could be even better. If a carbon price goes higher than 250, that may lower things even more. If population is well below 8.8, that would improve things more. And again, all of those could go the other way as well. So another interesting part of the En-ROADS data simulation is the impacts you can look at. So let's look at the impacts we've seen. We have temperature. We were looking at temperature change, but let's change that graph to CO2 concentrations. Most people listening to this or watching this, probably understand what parts per million are, CO2 parts per million. For most of human history, we've hovered between about 200 and 300 parts per million. Now we're at about 420 parts per million. That's 400 parts of carbon dioxide per million parts in a certain volume in the atmosphere, and that's heating our atmosphere. And you can see with all the things we've done, the parts per million start going down again about a little bit before 2040, and then by the end of the century, those are down, below, probably closer to 333 than 300. And probably they go below 400 probably in the mid 2040s. And again, that's if we do, we're very aggressive and do everything right, so to speak. So let's look at some other things. Sea level rise. You can see business as usual. By the end of the century, we'll have average sea level rise of about 0.7 meters, and just above half of that if we are very aggressive. Excuse me. Population exposed to sea level rise at risk of annual flooding, 374 million, down to 329 million. Living below high tides, 217 million to 175 million. So not a huge impact, but a significant one if you're within those numbers. Ocean acidification. This is a really interesting one. We all learned in chemistry class, if a solution can be, basic or acidic. Acids like, a lemon or an orange are very highly acidic, and that's, closer to 1. And basic is above 8 and up to, I think it's 15. Right now, our oceans are about 8.05 or 8.1. Before the Industrial Revolution, they were about 8.2. And as the ocean gets more acidic, and it gets more acidic because it absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere, as it gets more acidic, it's harder for animals with shells, such as some mollusks or shrimp. It's harder for coral reefs to survive. And that really messes with the ecosystems of the ocean. And there's concerns by the mid 2040s, if we're on the path, that black line there, if we stay on this path, it'd be very difficult for a lot of that marine life to live, which collapses the food web of the ocean, and you'll have less things. You may have more jellyfish on your plate as seafood than other things you're used to now, because those fish and those animals can't survive in an acidic environment. So you see, we kind of bend that curve again on this very aggressive scale before the 2040s back into a safe zone. crop yields from temperature. I thought this was an interesting one. See where we are, the business as usual case. By the end of the century, corn or maize will be about 20% less in crop yields, wheat 16%, rice 8%, soybeans 8%. I've seen numbers that are more aggressive or bad, if you want to look at it that way, than this, for those assumptions by the end of the century and those black lines. And of course, this won't just happen in 2099 and 2100. It'll get slowly worse year over year, and it already is in some places. But if we're very aggressive, those blue bars are, barely a blip in the decreased production of maize, wheat, rice, and soybeans. I'll just go through a couple more to show you some of the impacts. Species loss, more than 50%. This one, I remember doing the simulation was just so drastic. If we leave things as they are, kind of the business as usual case, invertebrates, we lose 51% of them. Insects, we lose 50% of them. Plants, we lose almost 50% of them. And mammals, we lose a quarter of them. And all those are zero if we're very aggressive, or nearly zero, if we're very aggressive on climate change mitigation. I'm happy to keep going through some of these, but we've got about 15 more minutes. I want to leave things open for questions if people have questions. Maria, are we getting any interesting questions in the chat?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions. I addressed one of them. So one was about the data sources for this simulator. I know it's pretty complex and draws on many things. The most interesting part of it is probably this relationship between different factors. Mm-hmm. But yeah, if you could elaborate on this data sources and how they came up with this, would be great, Matt.
Yeah, and I encourage you to jump into the En-ROADS website itself. But they have many data sources. They scanned things like that, all the IPCC reports, other scientific reports. I remember going through this when I first saw this En-ROADS a couple of years ago. But it was extensive. It's not just the IPCC reports or just reports from measurements in the North Sea, but that's part of it, or temperature readings in the Pacific, but that's part of it. It's many different scientific sources go into this.
Thanks, Matt. I was actually curious from my side the impact on from population. It surprised me that it had such a little impact on the temperature increase. Well, I'm wondering if it's because of the other parameters. So let's say if you had set parameters differently, would the impact be different?
Well, you can see we can, now that we're at the end of the simulation, you can see we get to 1.0 Celsius, right? I'm going to undo all this work. So if everyone's ready for that, I'll reset policies. So we go back to where we were, and you can see, what we would have lost, the species. I'll go back to the temperatures, or go back here to the graphs of temperatures where it impacts temperature change. All right, now let's just do population, right? And see what impact it has. Because it's hard to see after you've already done the carbon price and getting rid of oil, but most of the oil and gas and fossil fuels, it's going to have a smaller impact. But if you hold everything else steady and you go down to 8.8, it's only a little bit. And let's see if it goes up a lot, well, relatively a lot. It goes from 3.3 to 3.5 if you have very high growth. So population matters, but not as much. So a good thing to think about at population is, if you look at the use of, the carbon footprint, if you will, of the average American, I'm in America, or Canadians, Maria's Canadian, versus the average person in India or somewhere else. It matters where that population is. Our carbon footprints, your average American's carbon footprint is much higher. I think it's 4 or 5 times higher than the average Indian's carbon footprint. I don't have that off the top of my head, but of course, folks in the developed West are going to have the highest carbon footprints. So that gets more to economic growth than population, because it's what are you doing with that population? Are we consuming more? Are we using more? Are we traveling more? And focusing on economic growth on a planet with finite resources is part of the issue, part of the problem. So it's not so much a question of population, because that population is going to be consuming about the average of the population on that planet does now, are the assumptions, or it grows at a certain controlled rate. But if that growth goes down, or we're in a post-growth type of world, that has a much bigger impact. That's a great question. Any other questions?
So feel free to send questions in the chat if you have some. I think it's just worth playing with this. And I think we need to note that obviously it's not perfect, right? There's a lot of second, third effect impacts that are not captured here.
We had a hand raise.
Yeah, Julio has a question. So just to let you know, we are recording the session. We'll make it available on our platform. So if you are choosing to participate, then you're giving us a consent to use your recording to make it available to others that wish to follow. So if that's okay, Julio, go ahead with your question.
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So thank you, Matt and Maria, for organizing the session today. It was very informative. I was wondering because I just opened the website and I was testing a few of these factors and keeping all these factors in the business as usual, but improving bioenergy. So I think if you move it to the right, the bar of bioenergy, it's I think if you increase the subdivision of bioenergy, it seems that the temperature would increase slightly. And I was wondering what mechanism would happen if we did so. Like, why would temperatures increase slightly by, acting this way? I was wondering maybe methane emissions. I'm not sure.
Well, bioenergy is just, the type of bioenergy we're most familiar with is burning wood in a fire, right? But there's using waste or wood or other things to burn for energy that aren't, or other natural sources that aren't, people burn peat, or people burn wood, or people burn grasses, or people burn cow dung, for energy. It's those biological things they burn for energy that aren't fossilized, that aren't fossil fuels. And so if you do more of that, it slightly increases the temperature. But if you move away from that, it doesn't do much, but it does help a little bit. So that's what that is.
Okay, thank you, Matt.
We have another hand raise.
Yeah, we have Chinonso. Go ahead, Chinonso.
Okay, so thank you for the session, though my internet was a bit off and on, but I've picked up quite some interest, seeing how we can also maybe use this to test run some of the policies we've already worked on. Okay, my name is Chinos. I'm calling from Nigeria, and I'm working for a Center for Environmental and Sustainable Development. So we've worked within 2 frameworks, and we're working on the 3rd one now. One is the NDC. We work to update the current NDC. So we already have some metrics we think we can use maybe to just look at some of these are scenarios here. We also have the long-term strategy that is also there. And then we are now working on a just transition framework right now. So maybe we want to, what I want to ask is the baseline scenarios that we used, maybe if we use it to test some of the already existing models we have here, or policies we have here, will it be a bit reflective, or is it mainly focusing on Europe and developed countries as well?
Well, that's a good question, because let's say, for example, coal, the status quo. This is assuming global impacts. So coal is where I have the bar now. It's very highly taxed around the world, right? So that might not be the case everywhere. So say coal is very highly taxed in 75% of the world, but it's not very highly taxed in the others, and that might move things back to just to highly taxed, right? And that's not as impactful. So that's some of the adjustments you'll have to make. All these bars we're moving, these adjustments we're making are assuming global impacts. Not that local impacts don't matter, but this is the aggregate of all impacts globally.
All right, thank you.
Good. So we're at 12:45. I do not think we have any other questions coming in, but you're all very welcome to send us comments, feedback, other suggestions for such events at hi@ed4s.org. I'll put it into the chat here. And thank you everyone for attending, and hopefully you'll have a lot of fun with En-ROADS tool. A lot of documentation is available on their website as well as guides. So we invite you to dive deeper and to understand really what's behind it in order to inform your decision making.
And if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to myself and Maria on LinkedIn or through the ED4S website.